Krieger. I am Senior Learning Designer on the University of Pennsylvania School of Arts and Design online learning team, and I'm also an instructor and co-lead program supervisor in the program that Clay and I are going to talk about today.
Hey everyone, I am, of course, Meryl's colleague. I am an Associate Director of Instructional Design at the University of Pennsylvania School of Arts and Sciences online learning team. It's a really long title, but I get to do really fun work alongside Meryl. And we also teach in that certificate program that we're going to be talking about today. So we're really excited to have you in this space and to get started. So speaking of getting started, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about what we'll cover today in a few essential questions. We're going to talk a bit about what the program is, the certificate in digital strategies and culture. We're also going to talk about what our process was in developing that certificate, and it's ongoing, so it's a continual process. We're going to be discussing what we learned and continue to learn in that process. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit more about what we might share alongside you all in our conversation and discussion about exactly what we did and how we did it. In terms of how the participation is going to go, Greg mentioned at the very beginning, please feel free to share your questions in the chat as we go along. And we're going to be going to talk a little bit more at the end about specific questions that we have for discussion. So let's start off with that first question. What is the program? Before we get to the interactive discussion-driven portion that I just mentioned, we thought it might be helpful to offer a bit of context for the certificate in digital strategies and culture. It was the impetus for the collaborative efforts that we'll be talking about today. So in terms of structure, what we'll do is pass it back and forth, both because it's fun that way, and also because it models the collaborative process that we went through to kind of develop the certificate. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Meryl to talk about the certificate in digital strategies and culture.
Thanks, Clay. We can talk a bit about what the certificate is and where it's located within the landscape of other offerings at Penn and how it differs in the video that's linked on this slide. And I'm going to put a link to our video at the end of this session for you because we didn't want to spend all our time here just walking you through our program. But it's really important for us to make sure we're all on the same page. In case you didn't get a chance to view the video before our session, by the way, I've posted it to the this particular slide deck with that link into the Discord channel on presentations. So our certificate is made up of credit-bearing courses housed within an online Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences degree, which we call the BAAS for short. The applied portion is key here, as this is what organizes much of our focus on real-world examples that students might use outside our courses. Speaking of these students, the degree and the certificate are geared towards non-traditional learners who are older than a traditional student on average. They're often working full-time, and they're usually more inclined to speak from a range of personal and professional experiences that often help enrich activities and materials in the course. In other words, they have very different and more diverse needs than a traditional student at the University of Pennsylvania, and this much better reflects the larger world of working adults and adult learners in higher education. The courses within our certificate, and in fact across the BAS, are primarily asynchronous, which along with the online format makes them much more accessible for students around the world. We have students collaborating across multiple time zones and across multiple generations. I'll give the example that in my fall semester class, I had students on all the major continents in the world, and of all ages, ranging from, they went from 19 to early 70s. The courses within the certificate are mostly asynchronous, as I said, and this is important for our approach because the reality of these diverse experiences doesn't allow us to make blanket assumptions about what any one of us knows or what we should expect to happen in a learning environment. The other thing to emphasize is the accelerated 8-week time frame of the courses are just one of those disrupted expectations. So this kind of course requires much more attention and care in the ways that we design them because time isn't a luxury in such an intensive schedule. There are a number of benefits to this approach, but one of the most significant is the ways that it allows working adults to incorporate intensive asynchronous learning into their busy schedules. So what was our process? This revised idea of time that's built into the certificate was also built into our collaborative development process, which we're going to take a moment to explain next, since it's very integral to our vision and goals. And I'm going to pass this over to Clay to talk about the process we use to develop the certificate program in digital strategies and culture.
Thanks so much, Meryl. So this process of development, as we mentioned in the title of the slide, was collaborative. And we also, in that title, talk a bit about what it means to collaborate from our sensitive edges. So the term comes from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who writes that our sensitive edges, quote, enable us to live more porously, more mindful of the infinite changeability of our contexts, more open to each other and our needs, end quote. So we argue that our sensitive edges also allow us to remain open to the generative messiness that supports human-centered learning design, along with forms of meaningful collaboration. So all of us in this room are humans, I would assume, right? And we probably don't need to tell you that humans can be messy creatures. Most of us don't do well with one size fits all anything, really, especially in spaces that are designed to center diverse voices, particularly when it comes to students. So our process revolved around accounting for the beauty and the generative potential within other human messinesses that we might make room for and build into our digital learning. So for us, sensitivity to student voices within our collaborative process aligns with some of the goals of the larger BAS degree program, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. It revolves around equity, access, inclusion, and agency. And we'll talk about that last bit more in specific details when we get to some of the strategies we use for student-centered design in a few minutes. But before that, I think it's important to note that the clarity with which we attempted to communicate our vision and goals was of utmost importance to us. So a few of these goals and that connected to the larger vision include exploring the intersecting roles of race, class, gender, and sexuality in technology, and particularly when it comes to culture and development practices that allow us to engage in equitable, inclusive work across different forms of projects, right? This includes making digital content while analyzing how materials are imagined, how they're curated, and how they're shared in a variety of forms, from multimedia projects to digital portfolios, all of which are in the certificate courses that we're talking about, right? And then finally, it allows us to examine the ways that play, care, and trust can influence community building within and across teams and digital spaces. And we're going to take some time to talk about trust a bit more. But part of this process involved critical sensitivity to who our students were, to what context they would bring to the courses, and to how we hope to shift expectations about online learning for us all within the courses. This led us to learn quite a lot about what we should hold on to and even what we should let go of in designing our learning environments together. So speaking of those learning environments, I think it makes sense to focus a little bit more intently on what it is exactly we learned, right? So one of the things that we learned was that meaningful collaboration is rarely easy, even when it's simple, but it's definitely worth it. It helps to have a relationship that's built on mutual trust when you're working towards collaboration. And Moya Bailey talks about this. She talks about it as working at the pace of trust, which I think is important, especially for folk who are collaborating to build a certificate program, and definitely for folk who are in a class who are trying to do projects together, or even individual projects that are interdependent within a larger curricular structure. This includes trust between collaborators, trust in the materials, and trust in our agreed upon vision. And speaking of that vision and what it means to do collaboration in digital work, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Meryl, who's going to talk about specifically what we learned in that process.
Thanks, Clay. So we gathered a number of lessons about collaborative digital work. When we think about some of them, through our collaborative digital process, we realized that the idea of trust is embedded in nearly everything. We learned that it can also help to have a couple of specific elements. One that really helped us a lot was having a complementary skill set and values. We mentioned earlier that we came to this work from different disciplinary perspectives that grew out of the social sciences and digital humanities. Clay's background is in digital humanities, mine's in the social sciences. This was super helpful for us in developing guiding questions like, how can we analyze how members of a culture use technology as a locus for evolving or conflicting cultural practices and social change? We developed these questions together. What we didn't talk about earlier is that we both came to this project with a wide range of teaching experiences at different institutions, not just at the one that we're both currently housed at. And these shaped our shared interest in specific program structures and student outcomes. We understood walking in the door that students who would take these certificate courses might have more in common with non-traditional students that we taught at commuter schools and state-affiliated institutions than not. And when we sat with this for a while, it gave us a clearer sense of the ways we might shake things up a bit. So I guess what I'm saying here is that this all takes time, especially when you want to do it sensitively and carefully. But it's hugely rewarding to create something alongside someone you trust that you might not have dreamed of creating alone. And this was certainly the case for me and Clay. So I want to shift gears a little bit to what we might share. And this has to do with the specific things we can share about what we dreamed up, how we translated it into digital spaces, and why any of this matters to our larger conversation of collaborating from our sensitive edges. And I'm going to hand this off to Clay to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you, Meryl. So this is the part where we talk about how we did what we did. And there were a lot of different components, and I'm excited to talk with you a bit about it. And actually, Meryl and I are going to pass this off to talk specifically about the courses that we teach in the cluster and ways that they connect to other courses within the cluster as well. So I'll start us off by sharing how our discussion matches up with what we do in our work together. So it's important to note that all of what we share comes from somewhere in the process of design, development, and in teaching. We mentioned earlier that we would come back to strategies for student-centered design. So let's begin our share there. It can be tempting to let the LMS dictate the pace and shape of student engagement in online courses. We avoided this by offering spaces for collaboration outside the LMS. No matter the tool, we established early on in the courses that technology was not the end itself. Connection and collaboration was. So for example, in the digital literacy and cultural change course that I taught, which is one of the foundational courses for the certificate, students and I began the class as we ended it with a poetry exercise. Some students were initially put off by this. Poetry wasn't exactly what folks expected from a foundational course focused on digital technology, but it offered a form of careful literacy that allowed us all to advocate for different, more sensitive and human-centered kinds of communication in our shared learning spaces. It also allowed us to play around with the conventions of collaboration. I paid close attention to democratic ownership when designing this and other activities in the course. So each of us drafted project prompts and peer review guidelines together, and we saw those as acts of creative digital making. So we were also honest about the risks associated with such openness and vulnerability in the course. And the syllabus and the course site had acknowledgement of risk in the beginning that gave us a sense of what exactly we were getting into and established a sense of trust from the very start. And that was a goal, at least. So I also invited us all to answer a few questions at the beginning of the course that made room for our experiences and a range of diverse needs. So some of those questions were, what kind of course will not work for us? What guidelines might we put in place to avoid replicating such a course for ourselves and even for future learners? What shared expectations are important to us, and how might we hold ourselves accountable to those shared expectations? What do we need to feel safe, engaged, seen, and heard in our learning environment and what would help make that possible. And also, and this is one of my favorite parts, what brings us joy and how might we incorporate that into the work we'll do together. So after sharing, everyone shares their perspectives. We broke up into small groups to synthesize a collaborative document. In this case, we used Google Docs, into a collection of policies, which included, believe it or not, GIFs or GIFs, no matter how you want to say it, poetry, song clips. We had other components as well. And all of this ultimately shaped our presence and critical connection throughout the course. And again, went back to that building of trust with each other. So this was in some ways establishing an infrastructure for care and sensitivity, as well as mutual accountability very, very early on. It also affirmed our intentions for knowledge building. Instead of centering stagnant parameters that encourage model responses that was created before the students even got there, the course reflected our collective growth through contextualized work that we created as individuals and as part of a community. So this form of agency, I mentioned before that humans are messy, and this was no exception. Sometimes it was messy, but what it did was lay the groundwork for deep engagement and connection. And it also modeled forms of digital citizenship that invites us to kind of dwell in the mess and try to find something generative out of it. So I thought of it as forms of non-traditional placemaking on a small scale that we can practice in that space that we can then model or at least try out in the larger scale and larger society. So the final thing I'll say is that we in the course talked about serendipity. So we shared things that we stumbled upon. We talked about frustrations. We talked about fears. And we did all of this, again, outside of the LMS, right? We did it in Slack. And it's similar to the type of energy and vibe that we have in a Discord space. So we connected over music. We created soundscapes together, we co-curated playlists, and we worked through world building, and we even talked about capitalism and commodified hope and all these different types of concepts that I think we would not necessarily have had the opportunity to in a different type of environment. But again, the tools weren't the point. Creating compelling environments for meaningful learning was. Lectures were narrative podcasts with unit-driven story arcs and interactive transcripts. And of course, Meryl mentioned before that my interest is in the digital humanities. I'm also deeply invested in science fiction. So we talked about Octavia Butler, and we talked about different forms of technology that are expressed in science fictional thinking and how that enables us to expand our minds about what we can do for digital literacy purposes and how we can develop strategies around that. So all in all, those outcomes were personal, they were adaptable, and they were interdependent. And they also gave us a way of privileging design paths that eschewed fixed expectations and that encouraged us all to be sensitive advocates for learning, not just as an instructor, but as a co-learner and a co-facilitator in the course space. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meryl to talk about her course.
Thanks, Clay. The class I'm going to talk about is titled A History of Digital Culture, and I was very intentional about that title. And one of my main concerns for the course topic was to present a model for critical investigation of assumed knowledge. The goal I had was to balance giving structure for student exploration of a new way of conceptualizing how, in this case, technological innovation takes place, and also giving agency to the students to build their own learning and in supporting learning across the course. Like Clay, I chose a non-LMS tool, in this case it was Slack, as the primary mechanism for course activities and discussions. And the choice here was because it lacks a hierarchical infrastructure. All participants in that workspace had the same capabilities to post, share, and engage with everybody else in that space. And this was the first time I had done that as an instructor. And so it was an exploration for me as well. Because my course topic and approach were much more social science focused than humanities focused, I had to use that space quite differently. And some of the students in my class had walked out of Clay's class. So they ended up having to make some adjustments in how they thought about it too. So we talk in our introductory video in specific about some of the course questions that we developed for the class. And we gave an example of that early on in our presentation. But they were really crucial for us. And one of the ways that they were really crucial was in helping us integrate our mission and values into our work, including the very structure of the interactions in the class. So what did we do? I asked students to process readings and course content through a reflection process that was consistent across the weeks of the course, with instructions that were very transparent. I made absolutely no assumptions that the instructor role was the only one to introduce concepts to the class community. In fact, the community of practice within the Slack space encouraged students to take on the role of being mutually accountable through regular group activities and discussion. Like in any learning process, this peer accountability process was kind of uneven sometimes, but at the end of the day, what it did was create an environment that one of my students in their evaluation of the course noted that the Slack community was buzzing. This class felt really alive. This vibrancy was fostered and supported by both members of the instructional team, I had a TA for this, through regular and consistent feedback. And this modeling was recognized by the students, members of the community. I focused my practices here on the framing of student-provided materials, sometimes reframing content to help students practice exercising their critical thinking muscles through the lens of the course structure. I thought about it a lot as guide rails or training wheels on a bicycle to help people kind of model their behavior. And this was a process that I actively reinforced throughout the course and didn't just build in through my design practices. So to give you an example of this guidance was a comment I made on a student shared news article and TED Talk on the topic of artificial intelligence and algorithms. These were both written and presented by an AI expert who was clearly representing a coding perspective that assumed that AI is unbiased. And the students shared it as an example of this. Well, one of the key concepts we were exploring in the course was uncovering the extent to which this is a logical fallacy and the extent to which most people are unaware of such biases. So here was a comment that I made to do this kind of guide rail process. And for those of you who are familiar with sociology and anthropology literature, I was totally challenging Irving Goffman here. I said, just putting on my professor hat here to make a comment on the approach of this article. It ignores that human bias is a part of all incarnations of AI and algorithms. There was no superhuman who created the first one without any biases, any more than the first person to develop a marketable microphone didn't build in a preference for particular sound frequencies that matched what sounded good to their own ears. There is no such thing as an unbiased human. What there can be are humans who are aware of most of their biases and build checks and balances into the system they develop to account for them. So at this point, what we want to do is shift gears and talk about some of the things that we'd like to bring you into this conversation and start thinking about what strategies you can take away for your own online course design work. And we have a couple of these built in on our slide, and you'll see them in front. So this is kind of the first question. What strategies can you take away here? And we want to invite you in the chat to start suggesting ideas. We'd love to get into a much more active conversation. Our second question is, what does sensitive edges mean to you, to your program, to your faculty, and possibly to your student population? And what takeaways can you pull that would help you foster collaboration within diverse learning environments in your program? And we're also happy to take questions about more about what we did. So I want to open the floor. So I'm noticing Casey's comment about sensitive edges. Thank you for that. It was something that really struck home for us as well. The whole idea that sensitive edges is really crucial to design. And please, yes, you're welcome to unmute to ask a question if you like.
I'm sort of interested in how these practices, which just feel, I'm trying to get the right word, just wonderful to me, and I want to embrace them. How have they intersected with grading practices in your courses?
That's an excellent question. Clay, do you want to try it first?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Emma. Mm. In a lot of ways, that is the question, right? Especially considering some of the structures that exist in a larger curricular scale. So what we've done, and I'll speak specifically to my class, and I'll let Meryl talk about the work that she's done too, and then the larger certificate program. I mentioned during the description of the class that we co-developed documents around policies. And what we also did during that co-development process is talk about how we would organize them in terms of grades, right? So what does it mean to get this feedback, and what does an A mean to you? What does a B mean to you? What does a C mean to you? And we actually had a conversation about it within that document, right? So we developed a rubric together that enabled us to get there. And we also have it so that, well, at least we built it into the system that people could revise their work, right? So the grades weren't necessarily final. It was an invitation to do reflection, and in order to get deeper into the conversation about expectations, but also collaborative revision in a lot of ways. So that all that to say that sensitivity showed up in that space by allowing people to be sensitive to what their past experiences were, and also not to replicate ones that didn't work for them. Because a lot of what I heard from students was that grades felt divorced from the types of efforts that they were putting in there, sometimes in certain courses. And we didn't want to do that again. So what we did want to do is give all the students agency and trying to figure out ways that it can be meaningful to them. And we took them as the experts of their own experience, right? So we thought that it would be helpful to have a grading practice that did that type of work. Hope that helped to answer your question. Meryl, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that. I grappled with this one too, Emma. Thank you for asking about this. And it's something that I've been teaching online classes for a long time, and it's always been a big part of the question about how to do that. And like Clay, I tried to keep this as personal as possible without making it unwieldy to grade. And I think one of the ways to do that was in the reflection process to give clear criteria that I wanted them to apply, but also make sure that the process gave them a lot of ownership of what the ultimate goal was. So with each of my students, I met with them to decide what their larger projects were going to be. And that way I could make sure that they had a clear sense of what my expectations were. And also I could help give them a path to figure out where they wanted to take it. And for some of them, it was really interesting because they'd never tried doing this before. I had students who came to it because I had adult learners who wanted to learn about the social media that their kids were using. I had professionals who were applying digital technologies in one fashion or another in their jobs. And there was such a wide range of interests with that. So I had people who were building programs who wanted to explore something for a project that they were developing in their own company. And the goal there was, again, to give them a framework and then set them loose. And giving them that framework was the way that I was able to basically say, here's where you met the criteria and here's where you have room to go. And so in terms of having an academic criteria, because these were credit-bearing courses, you have to have some kind of clear criteria that's equitable for the students and also isn't going to make the instructional team go crazy because there's only so many hours in the day. The members of the team and we were very clear about giving feedback along the way. And we also built in a lot of peer accountability. So I built in a framework for students to be talking to each other about their projects and be giving guidance to each other. And again, this is where we would step in and say, you know what, this is a great idea. And maybe this is a good solution. Maybe this is a good source. Maybe this is a good approach, but here's where you might want to be careful. So we tried to meet everybody where they were at is the long and the short of it. And keep the structure as clear as we could. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'm an instructional designer that primarily works with faculty who are teaching and thinking about really powerful ways to start these conversations with them when they are really inside the
Yeah.
sharp edges, the delineated edges, can be really challenging, but I'm just really inspired by both of you incredibly. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would, oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Meryl.
I guess the only thing I would add is that as in wearing my instructional design hat, which feeds my instructor hat, I'm a huge fan of rubrics. So I practice what I preach. Go for it, Clay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel that tension. Also being an instructional designer, who's also an instructor. And one of the ways that one of the resources that have helped me has been Susan Blum's book on ungrading. And there's also Jesse Stammel's work on ungrading. There's a whole host of resources I'm happy to share on ungrading practices. And because we talk about iteration and because we talk about various forms of design that meets people where they are, not everybody might be interested in ungrading. And I completely and totally understand that. But there are things and strategies that you might be able to adapt to kind of shift the needle a little bit, right? So you don't have to kind of throw everything out wholesale, but to kind of adopt and adapt practices that work for the style that the instructor is comfortable with, and also that might push them a little bit more towards this forms of agency and sensitivity that we're talking about.
Clay and Meryl, this is Greg, your friendly facilitator. So I may have missed this as I was facilitating, but I was wondering if you could give the audience a sense of kind of the process with respect to time and energy, and kind of, what steps would you recommend in moving towards something like this as you're, well, I don't know if you are aware, at our university, we move a little slow sometimes, not like the corporate world. So I'm just wondering if you could give us a sense of kind of the process that you took and who was involved and how long that took.
Go for it, Clay. You start, because this whole thing started with Clay.
I'm not sure that's true, but I appreciate I appreciate that, Meryl. So you might not necessarily be surprised to know, Greg, that speed is not necessarily the biggest virtue of an institution like the University of Pennsylvania. It involves, and that can be a wonderful thing. Sometimes it can be challenging, but we learn through the challenges, right? And we learn to find the spaces that work for us within those challenges. And the spaces that work for us was actually the community that was built within the College of Liberal and Professional Studies, right? So the administration was on board from the beginning, because they understood the need for having courses that spoke to different forms of digital literacy and the various strategies that we would need to work towards in order to realize cultural change. And this was happening. This actually started to take off at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that changed the tenor of things, because people were a lot more open to understanding the need for online learning and also the potential of doing things that were transformative in the online learning space. And that included faculty of advisory committees that we presented this to, and we went through a process of a proposal, and they gave us feedback and we revised that. They also went through the process of a committee of folk who existed in different organizations and corporations, as well as students. So we got feedback from across the board for different people who might be stakeholders, either at the end of the certificate process or who might be stakeholders within the certificate process as well. And I think too, one of the most important bits was to be open about timeline and open about when we want to offer the courses. So because they are 8-week courses, we're a little bit more flexible of where they can appear, right? So you could take 2 of the courses in a traditional 16-week semester. And that helped to give us a sense of what the timeline would look like for the certificate roster. Were there other things that you thought make sense to add, Meryl?
I'm just thinking of what I can add to that. I can't emphasize enough how important it was that the leadership in our unit and within the program were on board from the very beginning, and in fact gave us both a lot of encouragement to develop this particular program. And we each started with one class, and that was the genesis of it. And then the collaboration process started when we started talking to each other about it. Because I was very aware, because Clay's first class in the certificate, it wasn't we didn't even think of it as a certificate at first. It was just courses that would meet a need in the program and that we knew were important. So we came to this with the value and the mission first, and then defined what we were going to create as it kind of evolved organically. I don't think either one of us anticipated that we were going to be developing what is going to ultimately be an 11-course certificate. It's going to be huge when we're all done. And we're still in the middle. I think we have 4 classes that are launched right now. We have 2 more that we're developing out that are going to launch in the next calendar year. And then there's a whole host of other courses around the BAAS that are also connected to ours by virtue of their topic and mission, that are also related to our program. So we had no idea that it was going to go the way it went. And we were both on for the ride. I think the collaboration for me was something that Clay and I have been working together now for nearly 4 years. In our role as instructional designers, we're on a very collaborative team. So we kind of had that cultural model of sharing ideas and working together and thinking through and problem solving together. We already had a foundation for that. And to me, that was hugely helpful. We were aware of some of the differences in our skill set when we walked in. And that was also a huge component of this. So all the things that we've talked about, some of this we knew walking in the door, and some of it we developed as we were working through it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that we mentioned we had the values and the goals. We also had a narrative that we thought was really important about the need, especially when it comes to conversations about digital citizenship and forms of digital fluency. I think that part of what gave us an in is being able to tell a story about what types of skills the students would have coming out of it, and how those skills would speak to a larger world that was in flux and that was changing. And I think that resonated with a lot of folk in administration, and also faculty and other folk too.
And I would add one last thing, and that is that we started surveying students in the classes to kind of confirm that what we were doing was meeting the needs of the students in the program. And we were kind of blown away by what we got. And it was confirmation that the listening that we'd done up front, that the experiences we brought in the door were confirmed by not only the students who showed up, but by the students who stayed and what they were taking away from the process. We would love more questions. I want to make a point that I gave a link to our intro video in the chat section. So please grab that link. Like I said, it's also on our slide deck, and you can see that in the Discord channel for presentation notes. But questions are welcome. Comments and thoughts.
Well, I'm going to ask another question. I guess I want to be a little careful in how I phrase this. So, do you believe this is a design mostly for arts and science, liberal arts types of courses, or do you think there is an opportunity to expand for something like this to kind of the traditional STEM type of courses? I could just tell you here at Colorado State, STEM is always a little cautious about online education, and sometimes a little slow to get on the train. And so they love data, right? And they want to see how it's working before they actually commit. So I'm just kind of wondering what your experience is, and whether you feel something like this can be easily transferable to like a STEM type of environment.
Clay, do you mind if I start this? And the reason I'm stepping up to start this part of the answer is because in my instructional designer role, that's who I primarily work with, is math and STEM faculty. And I think the piece that translates really well with the STEM faculty I work with is the bit about applied and helping connect students to the experiences they have and where their interests are. Most of my STEM faculty are familiar, and I'm just picking one point of entry because there are multiple, as I'm sure you know, with students who are coming in with kind of professional health intentions of one program or another. And thinking about what those goals are, what are the kinds of applications that are going to be relevant to the students? So that's often the way in to thinking about what student needs are going to be and what student interests are going to be, and about ways to engage students from there and how to build some of that community relationship around them, around those applications. And so it's kind of like the process Clay and I went through. It's collaborative and we meet them where they're at. And Clay's done plenty of STEM coursework as well. So I want to let him talk about what he's done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Meryl. I think the beauty of having a certificate like this is that it does include courses that would traditionally be in STEM places, right? Like, so we have coding courses that you explore Python, for example, as a programming language. And I think some of the takeaways that work for instructors in those courses is that it enables them to kind of share some of the core and key fundamental concepts in an environment where students can kind of work through it at their own pace, right? So they can record lectures. I mentioned before podcasts and all of that too. But they can also do screen sharing recordings where they kind of work through a specific process, concept, proof, and then share that in the online space so that by the time students get together, it's not only about kind of digesting the content, it's actually getting into the meat of having a conversation about it. Within the digital space. So it's that flip model, of course, and it makes it a lot easier, but it also makes it easier for students to have kind of conversations that allow them to share and show the work that they've done, right? So they can go through the process of what the steps that they took, they can record that, they can share it in the digital environment, and they can also have a record of their process of development throughout the course that's easier to track and trace in that space because of the ways that it's stored. So we usually tell instructors that, but also that they have something then that they can use as a model for their own revision, the instructors that is, as the course develops and with different student populations, right? So that enables students, again, to kind of go back if they had a hard time with a specific concept, or if they didn't understand a particular data set and they need to kind of go back through during office hours, it's easier for that to happen in that space and the environment too. So I think that often what we do is try to share the benefits in a lot of ways without using the physical environment as a default standard, which I think is the important bit, right? There are affordances that the digital space allows that you would never get in the physical environment. So starting off with the physical environment puts us at a disservice
Right.
From the very beginning, I think. And I know that can be a difficult shift to make for instructors. So again, it could be just adapting certain portions of the digital platform or different digital environment in their teaching practice that then they develop over time, right? That they add more and more onto over time and when they get into that space. We have in the beginning when I first came into the team, a lot of hybrid courses that use some online elements and some face-to-face elements. And many of those hybrid courses, including some like the math ones that Meryl is the instructional designer for, have shifted completely into online space.
Yeah. I would add one of the other things that we've done in our Dig C certificate that has been very fruitful for a lot of the STEM faculty. That's a piece of this whole conversation, is how to give, again, students ownership of some of this process. And so particularly in the online class space, building on what Clay said about how hard it can be for a lot of faculty to make that shift from what they're used to seeing in an in-person class to the different kind of thinking that's necessary for an asynchronous and primarily online course. Was an approach I took because I offered optional synchronous classes for my students at kind of strategic points across the semester. And this is actually something that I want to talk, I'm glad it's come up, because it turned out to be a totally unexpected win for the process we were developing. And it was that in order to make sure that students were going to get what I was hoping them to get, and the way I scaffolded in these synchronous sessions, because I knew not everybody was going to be able to come. So I required everybody to share a question or a comment that they wanted to be addressed in the session. And they had to turn it in before the session started. And it's, I think, critical because in any kind of session where you're not necessarily, you want to have a more open conversation. And it's something that you can build into an in-person class because students have the habit and the ingrained, they're taught right from the time they start going to school on that you go to class. And then what happens in class is going to be a process. And there's going to be all sorts of things that happen in that space. Well, how do we do something that's appropriate for an online course design that's going to give students some kind of agency and ownership in the space? Well, giving them that space and getting them in the habit of asking those questions to set up those sessions, it actually mushroomed because I only required it 4 times across the class. And at the end of the first session that I did, one of my students unmuted themselves and said, "Can we please do this every week?" So I didn't require it every week. I didn't build in the required questions every week, but it built a pattern. And I always had between a third and half the class show up. And we had some amazing conversations about the content we were working through and the amount of learning that happened in that space. It was totally unplanned, but it's something that I am now building in. And it's also something that I found for a lot of my STEM faculty becomes an opportunity to kind of free themselves from trying to figure out how to get people to show up in an online class for a session like that. So I hope this answers your question a bit.
Yes, it did. And I think with that, that's a good way to end. So I would encourage our participants to join, perhaps join you guys in the Discord channel where we can continue the conversation. And Meryl and Clay, thank you for presenting today and participating in our conference. Hope everyone has a great weekend, and thank you again for attending the ELK conference for this year.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.